I didn't start this experiment to prove anyone wrong. I didn't do it to create content or to sell a course. I did it because a few years ago, I looked at my garden budget and realized I was spending more on cedar lumber and galvanized screws than I was saving on groceries. That didn't sit right with me. The goal of a homestead, even a small suburban one, is independence, not just a different kind of shopping list. So I decided to test the assumptions we are all handed when we buy our first packet of seeds. I wanted to see if the shape of the garden bed itself actually mattered to the plants, or if it was just about what looked tidy to the neighbors. I cleared a consistent patch of land that gets full sun right there past the tool shed. And I set up 5 different growing zones. I wanted a fair fight. The first was the classic, the raised wooden box. We all know this one. It's the standard image of the modern American garden. I built it 4 ft by 8 ft, 12 in deep, filled with a premium blend of soil. Next to it, I tilled up a traditional row garden, the kind you see on commercial farms, just flat earth turned over in long straight lines. Then I tried a keyhole garden, a circular design with a compost basket in the center that is supposed to feed the soil constantly. I left one patch completely flat using a no-dig method, where I simply layered compost on top of the grass without shaping it at all. Finally, in the last spot, I built something that looked a bit strange compared to the others. I didn't use any wood or stone. I just piled organic matter and soil into a long, tall, rounded mound. It looked like a loaf of bread sitting on the grass. Over the next 2 seasons, I planted the exact same crops in each bed: tomatoes, peppers, greens, and root vegetables. I watered them the same amount. I gave them the same amount of sunlight. But as the months went on, I started to notice something that frustrated me. The bed I had spent the most money and time building, the raised wooden box, was arguably the most fragile system in the group. It dried out faster. The soil temperature fluctuated wildly between day and night. The plants there were always the first to wilt when the July heat settled in. We are often taught that a garden is a structure we build like a shed or a patio. We treat it as an architectural feature. We frame it, we square it off, and we try to contain nature within rigid 90-degree angles. We prioritize how the garden looks from our back porch over how the roots feel underneath the soil. But plants do not understand carpentry. They understand hydrology. They understand temperature stability. When we lift the soil up into a box, we are essentially putting our plants on a baking sheet and suspending them in the air. We are increasing the surface area exposed to the wind and the sun, which accelerates evaporation. I realized that by building these beautiful, tidy boxes, I was actually creating a moisture problem that I then had to solve with constant watering. I was creating a temperature problem that I had to solve with mulch and shade cloth. I was fighting the geometry of the bed itself. The flat rows weren't much better. They compacted easily and turned into mud channels when the heavy spring rains came. The keyhole garden worked well, but it was complicated to construct and difficult to scale up if you wanted to feed a family of 4. But that strange rounded mound, the one that cost $0 and required 0 trips to the hardware store, that was the quiet surprise. While the tomatoes in the box were struggling to pull moisture from the drying corners, the tomatoes on the mound were dark green and heavy with fruit. They weren't just surviving. They were growing with a vigor that I hadn't seen in the other beds. It became clear to me that I had been focusing on the wrong things. I had been focused on containment while the plants were asking for connection. The best shape wasn't the one that looked the most engineered. It was the one that mimicked the way the earth naturally piles on a forest floor. It turns out the most efficient technology for growing food isn't a cedar plank. It is the geometry of the soil itself. I want you to picture a square wooden planter box in your mind. It looks sharp. It looks organized. But nature hates a sharp corner. If you dig into the soil right at the corner of a raised bed during a dry spell, you will find dust. That 90-degree angle is a structural weakness, not for the wood, but for the life inside it. That corner is exposed to the air on 2 sides. It heats up faster than the center, and it bleeds moisture twice as fast. When we force our food to grow in these rigid geometries, we are creating stress points. We are asking the roots to inhabit a space that is fundamentally fighting against them. During the stress test in my garden, the difference became undeniable. The plants near the edges of the wooden boxes were always stunted compared to the ones in the middle. The wood itself, even though it was thick cedar, acted like a wick. On hot afternoons, the timber would heat up, drawing moisture out of the soil and evaporating it into the air. I was essentially watering the wood, not just the tomatoes. This is why so many of us feel like we are failing when our gardens struggle in August. We think we don't have a green thumb or that we picked the wrong fertilizer. But the reality is often simpler. We are fighting physics. We are trying to keep a small elevated block of soil wet in an environment that wants to suck it dry. When you lift soil out of the ground and isolate it in a box, you sever its connection to the Earth's natural thermal mass. The ground deep below your feet stays relatively cool and stable, usually around 55 bar, regardless of what the air temperature is doing. Native soil benefits from this stability, but a raised box is cut off from that thermal battery. It sits on top of the ground surrounded by air. When a cold front comes through, the soil in the box chills instantly. When a heat wave hits, it bakes. The roots are on a roller coaster of temperature fluctuations that the plant has to spend energy adapting to, energy it should be using to grow fruit. This was the realization that changed everything for me. I stopped looking at my garden as a construction project. I put down the drill and the measuring tape. I realized that building a garden was the wrong verb. You don't build a garden, you shape the earth. The goal is to maximize the volume of soil while minimizing the surface area exposed to the drying wind. You want shapes that hug the ground, not shapes that stand apart from it. I looked at the mound I had created. It had no corners. It had no vertical sides to catch the wind. It was a continuous curve. This shape meant that the wind just rolled over it rather than hitting it flat on. The evaporation rate plummeted. The soil inside wasn't separated from the earth below. It was an extension of it. The worms, the moisture, and the temperature could move freely up and down from the deep reserve of the subsoil up into the root zone. By letting go of the need for straight lines and rigid borders, I wasn't just saving money on lumber. I was stepping out of the way and letting the thermodynamics of the earth do the heavy lifting for me. The winner of the experiment wasn't the system with the highest price tag. It was the one that looked the most like the landscape itself. I call it the Earth Contour System, mostly because that sounds better than a pile of dirt. But the concept is ancient. In gardening circles, you might hear people whisper about Hugelkultur or permanent raised beds. But we don't need difficult German words to understand why this works. We just need to look at how a hill functions. The winning shape is a long rounded mound. It stands about 2 to 3 ft tall in the center and slopes gently down to the ground on both sides. It is usually about 3 or 4 ft wide at the base. From a distance, it looks like a long wave rolling through the backyard. There are no timbers holding it up. There are no metal corners. It is simply earth-structured and shaped to stand on its own. When you switch to this shape, you stop treating your garden like a container. A wooden box is a container. Its job is to hold material in. But a contour bed is a biological engine. Its job is to let roots spread out. This is a critical shift in mindset. When a tomato plant grows in a box, its roots eventually hit the wooden side. They turn, they circle, and they become congested. They are trapped in a prison we built for them. But in a contour bed, the roots have freedom. They can dive deep into the central core, or they can spread laterally through the slopes. They never hit a wall. They never hit a hot zone where the sun is baking the lumber. They just find more soil. This shape also changes the way you interact with gravity. In a flat garden, gravity packs the soil down every time it rains. The water sits on top, pooling and suffocating the soil life. In a contour bed, gravity works for you. The heavy rains hit the curved surface and shed off the sides, filtering down slowly rather than drowning the roots. The soil structure stays fluffy and loose because you never ever walk on the mound. You only walk beside it. The earth inside remains aerated and light season after season without you ever needing to pick up a rototiller. Many people hesitate here because they think the soil will wash away. They assume they need walls to keep the garden from dissolving in the first thunderstorm. But this is where the biology takes over. Within weeks of building a mound, the fungal networks and root systems of your plants bind the soil together. It becomes a stable living structure. It holds itself up. By removing the walls, you are removing the barrier between your garden and the rest of the ecosystem. You are creating a shape that invites life in rather than walling it off. This isn't just a way to plant seeds. It is a way to build a permanent landscape that gets stronger every single year. To really understand why the contour system outperformed every other bed in my garden, you have to look at what is happening underneath the surface. If you were to slice one of my mounds in half right down the middle, you wouldn't just see a pile of dirt. You would see an internal engine that drives the whole system. This engine is built out of materials that most people burn or throw away. When I construct these beds, I don't start with soil. I start with wood. I take old logs, fallen branches, and rotting firewood, the trash of the homestead, and I lay them down as the core foundation of the bed. I stack them tight right on the grass. Then I pack smaller sticks, leaves, and grass clippings into the gaps. Only after I have this solid core of organic mass do I cover it with the topsoil and compost. This might sound counterintuitive. We are taught to remove debris from our gardens, not bury it. But by burying that wood, you are installing a biological battery that will power your garden for years. Here is the physics of it. Wood is essentially a hard sponge. When the heavy rains come in the spring, that buried wood core soaks up water. It becomes heavy and saturated. Then, as the season turns and the summer sun starts to bake the surface of the earth, that wood holds on to its moisture. It creates a water table inside the bed itself, raised up above the ground level. In a traditional flat garden or raised box, the water drains away or evaporates, leaving the soil dry. But in a contour bed with a wood core, the moisture is released slowly from the center outward. It wicks up into the root zone exactly when the plants need it most. I have gone out to my garden in the middle of a drought when the lawn was turning brown and crunching under my boots and dug my hand into the side of one of these mounds. 3 inches down, the soil was cool and damp. I didn't put that water there. The mound did. This changes the behavior of your plants. In a surface-watered garden, roots stay near the top because that is where the sprinkler hits. That makes them vulnerable. In this system, the roots sense the moisture reserve deep inside the mound. They dive down. They anchor themselves into that decomposing wood core. This makes the plants incredibly resilient. They aren't waiting for you to come home from work with a hose. They are drinking from a reservoir that you built into the geology of the bed. Over time, that wood slowly breaks down. As it decays, it generates a tiny amount of heat, which extends your growing season in the fall. It also releases nutrients, slowly feeding the soil life without you needing to add chemical fertilizers. You stop being a person who carries water and fertilizer to a plant. Instead, you become the architect of a system that waters and feeds itself. You do the hard work once, shoveling the mound, and then you let nature do the maintenance for the next decade. When you look at a flat garden bed or a raised box, you are looking at a two-dimensional surface. You are limited by the square footage of the lumber you bought. If you build a box that is 4 ft wide, you have exactly 4 ft of planting space across. But nature doesn't work in flat plains. Mountains and hills have more surface area than flat plains. This is the hidden harvest of the contour system, and it is the detail that usually convinces people to finally drop the shovel and pick up a pitchfork. By shaping the earth into a tall, rounded arch, you are essentially bending the growing surface. If you take a tape measure and lay it flat across a 4 ft wide patch of ground, you get 48 in. But if you drape that same tape measure over the curve of a 3 ft tall mound, you might get 6 or 7 feet of planting surface on that same footprint. You haven't bought any more land. You haven't expanded your fence line. You have simply unlocked vertical space that was previously invisible. In my experience, this shape yields about 30 to 40% more planting area than a flat bed occupying the exact same spot in the yard. This three-dimensional shape changes how you plant. You stop thinking in rows and start thinking in zones. The top of the mound, the crest, is the driest and sunniest part. That is the penthouse. That is where I plant the crops that love heat and need good airflow, like tomatoes, peppers, corn, or okra. They stand tall at the peak, their leaves soaking up the morning sun from the east and the evening sun from the west. Then you have the slopes. This is where the magic happens. Gravity pulls moisture down from the crest, so the sides of the mound stay consistently damp. This is perfect for root vegetables. I plant carrots, beets, and onions along the shoulders of the mound. Because the soil is loose and not compacted by walking, the carrots grow straight down without resistance. They don't hit a hard pan layer. They just glide through the soft earth. But the most sophisticated part of this system is how it manages the sun. A flat garden gets the same sun everywhere. A contour bed creates microclimates. If you orient your bed running east to west, you suddenly have a south-facing slope and a north-facing slope. The south side gets the intense direct heat. That is where I put my basil and my eggplant. They thrive in that furnace, but the north side is shaded by the crest of the mound itself. It stays cooler. In the heat of July, when lettuce usually turns bitter and bolts to seed in a flat garden, my lettuce on the north slope of the mound is still crisp and sweet. It thinks it is still spring because it is living in the shadow of the mountain. By using geometry instead of chemicals, I can grow cool weather crops and hot weather crops in the same bed at the same time, just inches apart. Most gardeners view the first hard frost as a stop sign. It marks the end of the relationship with the land for the year. We drain the hoses, put the tools in the shed, and accept that the season is over. But when you move from a wooden box to a massive earth contour, you realize that the soil doesn't operate on the same calendar as the air. The air temperature might drop to freezing, but a mound of this size has momentum. It acts like a massive thermal flywheel. Because the contour bed is so heavy and dense, filled with thousands of pounds of damp soil and organic matter, it resists temperature changes. It takes a long time to heat up, but it takes an even longer time to cool down. When the autumn nights start dipping into the 30s, the soil inside the mound is often holding on to the heat it absorbed back in September. I have walked out to my garden on a crisp November morning when the grass was crunchy with white frost and seen that the greens growing on the mound were completely unfrozen. The earth was radiating just enough warmth to create a protective bubble around the plants. In a raised box where the cold air circulates underneath and around the sides, that heat is lost almost instantly. In the mound, it is banked. This thermal stability is boosted by the internal engine we built in the center. Remember that core of rotting wood? Decomposition is a combustion process. It is a slow biological fire. As the bacteria and fungi break down the carbon in the logs deep inside the bed, they release energy in the form of heat. It isn't enough to bake bread, but it is enough to keep the root zone active long after the flat ground has gone dormant. You are essentially planting your garden on top of a very slow, very mild heating pad. This internal warmth keeps the microbiology alive, meaning your soil is still being improved and aerated by worms, even while you are inside drinking coffee by the fire. This changes the reliability of your food system. We often obsess over peak harvest, how many pounds of tomatoes we get in August. But real food security is about the edges of the season. It is about how early you can start and how late you can go. The contour shape helps here too. In the spring, the steep angle of the mound faces the low sun more directly than flat ground does. It warms up faster. The snow melts off the south face of the mound weeks before it melts off the flat lawn. This allows you to plant your peas and spinach while your neighbors are still waiting for the mud to dry. The system bridges the seasons. It smooths out the violent swings of the weather. When you work with nature's tendency to seek balance, you stop panicking about a late frost or an early freeze. You know the thermal mass is doing the work for you. You aren't forcing the garden to perform. You are simply relying on the physics of a large living object to maintain its own equilibrium. It turns the garden from a seasonal hobby into a year-round presence that is always ready, always working, and always quietly preparing for the next seed. The biggest change this system brought to my life wasn't just the size of the tomatoes, it was what happened to my Saturday mornings. For years, I spent my weekends managing the garden. I was repairing rot in the wooden boards. I was mixing expensive bags of potting soil, and I was dragging hoses back and forth across the yard. I was working for the garden. Now the garden works for me. When you stop fighting the natural shape of the land, the urgency disappears. You stop worrying if you missed a day of watering. You stop panicking about the pH balance because the rotting wood is buffering it for you. The anxiety is replaced by a quiet, steady predictability. There is a profound sense of relief that comes from cutting the cord with the hardware store. We have been trained to think that growing food requires a credit card. We think we need cedar, galvanized screws, plastic liners, and chemical feeds. But when you build a contour bed, your material list is just dirt, wood, and time. I walk past the fertilizer aisle now without even looking. I don't need what they are selling. My garden generates its own fertility. I am less dependent on the grocery store for food, yes, but I am also less dependent on the supply chain to grow that food. That is a level of independence that feels very different from just having a few fresh peppers. It feels like security. It brings a peace of mind that I think many of us are looking for. We want to know that if things get tight or if prices go up, we have a system in the backyard that doesn't ask for money. It just asks for patience. It is a savings account that pays interest in calories. When I look out the window now, I don't see a project that needs maintenance. I see a living system that gets better every year without me doing a thing. The older the mounds get, the richer the soil becomes, the fungal networks get stronger, the water retention improves. It is the only asset I own that appreciates in value while I sleep. If this makes sense to you, I'm not going to ask you to tear up your whole backyard. I'm not going to ask you to rent a bulldozer. In fact, I would advise you not to. Just start small. Go to a corner of your yard that you have ignored. Gather some fallen branches, pile up some leaves, shovel the earth into a simple, humble mound, plant a few seeds on it, and then just watch. Watch how the water moves. Watch how the plants hold themselves up. You don't need to do it all at once. You just need to put one shovel in the ground and trust that nature knows what it is doing. She has been growing forests this way for a long time. She is happy to grow your dinner too. If this experiment changed the way you look at the soil beneath your feet, please subscribe to the channel and like this video. We are uncovering the natural laws that have been hidden by modern convenience. Let's cultivate a more resilient future together. The next chapter of our journey into the earth will begin soon.